I love this show. Not really much else to add. Let's talk about it. Hello everybody and welcome to my spoiler recap and review of episode 5 of Loki, which is entitled Journey into Mystery. And I don't know if the writers know this, but that's the same name as the comic book that introduced Thor and Loki. What a weird coincidence. As always, this is a full spoiler recap and review, so if you haven't seen episode 5 of Loki and you don't want to be completely spoiled by what happens, you should probably pause the video, go watch it, and come back. I'm not going to tell you to turn it off, but go check it out because this show, as I said at the cold open there, I love everything about this show, and it keeps getting better every single week. Yes, even including episode 3. I'm one of those people that liked that episode, and I will fight to the death. Not quite to the death, but I will have a very strenuous conversation with you about why I think that episode was a really good character development episode. Everything was just so on par in this episode of the show. The acting, the music, the writing, the cinematography, the special effects. If Loki is able to nail the finale next week, then this could easily be one of my top 5 favorite things in the MCU. I love almost everything about this show to such a degree that I cannot wait for next week. Really quick before we start though, I've gotten some feedback and it's sort of escalated over the last couple weeks about how I structure my reviews. Yes, this is largely a recap because I like to go over the events in the episode, sort of recap them for you and for me. It helps to structure my thoughts. Things like Easter eggs and theories and spoilers, etc. for upcoming episodes. That's not really what I go into. I very much like to just talk about what happened this week. If it's not your bag, that's totally cool. There's so many other people that are doing great reviews out there, but that's just going to be how this one is structured. We start this episode where the last one ended. That's a pretty convenient place. And we find out that the place where Loki has ended up isn't some alternate reality New York. You know, we saw Avengers Tower there last week. No, it's a place called the Void. And it's explained as pretty much the place where all of existence collides and then ceases to exist. But it's not the kind of ceasing to exist where you show up and you're just gone. This is sort of like a holding room, a waiting area for all of the different pruned things, Loki and non-Loki, to coexist until they're destroyed. The Void is the knot, the end of the timeline that we heard Mobius talking about in previous episodes when he was saying that the Timekeepers are basically having one sacred timeline and they're untangling everything, and then once they get to the end, which is the Void, or at least so they want us to believe, if they can just kind of untangle this void, then we'll have one timeline and the TVA will no longer be needed. Now, what we're learning is that most of that is complete BS, but this is what was being hinted at and referred to in previous episodes. But the Void isn't just home to pruned variants, it's also home to a monster called Alioth, and that is the destructive force that is usually the doom for anything that is pruned and sent to the Void. And Loki is not going to survive without help. Luckily, he has the Loki variants that we saw at the end of last week's episode. We have Kid Loki, Classic Loki, Boastful Loki, and Alligator Loki. Last week, I didn't mention Alligator Loki as a variant because I stupidly assumed that he was just Kid Loki's pet. I was not thinking fourth dimensionally, as Doc Brown would say, and so I never considered that Alligator Loki would be his own independent Loki variant. I also love that the ruler of this little cluster of Lokis is Kid Loki, and that he got that title by killing Thor. That was the Nexus event that got him pruned, and everyone pretty much just bows down to him as the ultimate badass. But when you think about it, when you have a group of Lokis, what better way to win over their respect and allegiance than by being the Loki that actually is able to banish the god of thunder? This sequence as the Lokis make their way through the Void and we see the remnants of other realities is packed with MCU Easter eggs, and I'm sure there are 10 times as many as I'm going to point out right now. I would like to point out my favorite first and foremost, which is that the Thanos copter exists now, and I don't care if it's part of an alternate timeline, it is now MCU canon. We've been talking about the Thanos copter. I remember we were doing videos about it when I was still over at Screen Junkies and Fandom. It is hilarious to see it just pop up in the background, and it shows why shows like Loki are so important for world building in the MCU. When you bring in things like different realities and different timelines, different universes, you can have these cheeky little nods. You know, listen, we all know that Josh Brolin was never going to be doing mocap driving around the Thanos copter, and yet in a show like Loki, where you loosen up the formula, you're able to have fun, you can get these references in. That's what I love about this particular show and its place in the MCU, and the fact that it's on Disney Plus. It's not a a 2-hour movie. You can put in these different things and you don't have to worry about explaining why there is the Thanos copter. You also see, as we're descending down into the Loki's lair, Mjolnir. Perhaps this could be a hint as to how we may see Mjolnir in another Thor movie or in another movie project. If it's just kind of floating out there in the void, maybe the void gets blown up. Maybe everything gets kind of blown away into different timelines. And then there was an Easter egg. Listen, I'm not the most eagle-eyed Easter egg spotter, but there was a Thor frog in a jar that said T365, which is a reference to Thor number 365, a 1986 comic book, which did feature a frog version of Thor. So that's an inside nod to a lot of comic book fans. Fun fact, I am mortally afraid of frogs. Probably my biggest fear on the planet Earth is frogs and toads. And even still, I like this Easter egg. That's the power of Thor. That's the power of a good comic book reference. There wasn't a whole lot of TVA action in this episode, really just 2 extended scenes. The first one has Ravonna talking to Sylvie where we left them last week, and I am not buying this whole act from Ravonna. Oh, I'm just as in the dark as you are. Let's team up. I didn't buy it for a second in this episode, and I still think that she knows more than she's letting on. I knew that this whole thing about, the experimental void spaceship. First of all, I'm glad that this experimental void spaceship didn't actually exist, because that would have been a repetition of a different beat that we had earlier this year in WandaVision with the experimental craft that could drive into the Hex, the craft that didn't work at all but did end up getting Monica Rambeau power. So I'm glad that we didn't go through that whole beat again. Shame on you, Ravonna, for using our poor innocent Miss Minutes as a way to stall in order to get Sylvie recaptured. It doesn't work because Sylvie is smarter than the average bear. She's cornered. Ravonna has almost got her captured again when she says, you know what, screw it. If you're not going to help me get Loki, I'm just going to go get him myself. She prunes herself and finds herself in the void. Now that is a leap of faith, because she could have just been ending her own existence. Instead, she lives to fight another day, and once again, Sylvie has slipped through the hands of the TVA, although Ravonna thinks that this is going to be the end of her because nothing survives the void. Now it's time for a little bit of Richard E. Grant appreciation, which, let's be honest, every day should be Richard E. Grant Appreciation Day. But the scene that we find with all of the Lokis hanging out in their lair, which looks like a pretty cool lair, by the way, where we have classic Loki talking about the fact that he did not end up getting killed by Thanos, and then floated away in the space debris after Thanos' attack. And then when he realized that everywhere he went, only pain followed, this idea that he just basically went into exile. He lived a solitary life, but even then he found himself wanting to know, did people miss him? He wanted to reconnect with his brother Thor, who he thought was the person that he hated the most, and that's when the TVA got him. When he tried to step off of this life in exile, that's when he got captured and pruned and sent to the void. But this idea of Loki's being the god of outcasts, this is a theme that we see repeated throughout this show. The fact that Loki is coming to terms with his own nature, with his nature of bringing pain, his nature of being an outcast, of being alone, of losing. We've seen different versions of Loki deal with these themes throughout the run of the show. And this is some of the most creative character development I've seen in a comic book project or in a TV show that deals with an existing character, because you also have multiple different versions of the same person who have all learned different lessons, and then you're able to bring them together, some of them like Loki and Sylvie for multiple episodes, others like classic Loki and Loki in this episode, to compare notes, to talk, to chat, to have people talking to them that know more about them, like Mobius does, than they know about themselves. It's such an intriguing and a different and a unique way to bring new dimension to the character, and this is something that Loki, I think, has done throughout the course of the series. It's something that WandaVision, I think, did in fits and starts, but that this show has done all the way from beginning to end, is to not only give us a Loki adventure, but to show us more about Loki than we knew before, to see him learning things about himself. That's what I love most about this show, is I actually feel like I'm getting to know this version of Loki more than I've gotten to know any other version of the character, and that's a success in my eyes. I do have to make a disclosure here, and I'm going to chalk this up to me just being, first of all, usually when the end credits roll, looking at this amazing design that they do, all of the set design and the buttons and switches and dials and everything they do for the credits of Loki. Today, though, I noticed the written by credit was a writer named Tom Kaufman. He's also a supervising producer on the show. Tom Kaufman and I were actually roommates for a little under 2 years when I lived in Los Angeles. the two of us and a third friend of ours had a very cheap apartment in Silver Lake that we stayed in, and it was a lot of fun. I met Tom through the Channel 101 community. By the way, if you want to have your mind blown, research and look at the talent that has come through Channel 101 over the years. So many actors that you've seen in different TV shows, directors, writers, TV writers, film writers. It was a great time. I was very heavily involved with Channel 101 for a number of years. I hadn't seen Tom in a few years, so I didn't know what he was working on, and I had either seen his name and not really connected the dots in my head, or completely missed his name in previous episodes. So the reason that I'm saying this is, number one, I'm just really happy for my friend. I just think it's really cool that a friend of mine from several years back gets to work on a show as awesome as Loki and is doing such a great job. And secondly, as a critic, because I am giving my opinion on the show, I do think it's important to note that I do have a personal connection, even though I didn't know about the connection until today, with somebody who works on the show. It's not going to affect what I think about the show, and it is going to affect our friendship potentially if the show sucks next week. I'm really keeping my fingers crossed that the season finale is not going to suck, because that's going to be an awkward conversation. Another fun fact is that Tom is also a staff writer and has his name on a number of episodes for the first couple seasons of Rick and Morty, which may be why this later collection of Lokis reminded me a little bit of the Council of Ricks in a good way from that show. After the Lokis all have their chat and their heart-to-heart, a bunch of other Loki variants show up, and then we see what happens when a group full of flawed narcissists all hangs out together. It's kind of like hanging out in a room full of stand-up comedians. They all start competing and then betraying each other. And what else would you expect from a collection of Lokis? There were so many different fun ones to spot. We also got another Tom Hiddleston version of Loki, the President Loki variant, that had gotten so much thumbnail and trailer time over the last few months. I know a lot of people were probably expecting more from this character, but I liked this beat with him. They all get into a fight with each other. President Loki is de-handed by Alligator Loki. I just like this idea of like, well, I betrayed you. Well, I betrayed you. Well, we betrayed you. Of course, that's what Lokis would do when they would get together. And it's this kind of Sisyphean thing of like, this is probably not the first time that they've done this. It's almost like, war reenactors where everybody shoots each other and they fall down and then they get right back up and they're like, all right, Hank, see you next week. I feel like that's what the Lokis do with each other when they're hanging out. Loki, Kid Loki, Classic Loki, and Alligator Loki excuse themselves from this party and head out to destroy Alliath, or at least that's Loki's plan. But Sylvie, who's now shown up in the void, has her own plan. She's had a brief connection with the monster, and she thinks that she can enchant it and then try to figure out who's really behind what's going on. Sylvie evades destruction as soon as she arrives in the void with the help of Mobius, who's still alive. Yay! I mean, we all knew that he was, but still, when he pulled up in that pizza delivery car, I was just so damn happy to see Owen Wilson, and we're going to get to see him again next week. But Mobius is not very happy. He's actually pissed that he's been manipulated by the TVA all these years, and when he talks to her and he says, when you think that the ends justify the means, there's pretty much nothing that you won't do. You can see now that Mobius is now being racked with guilt by what he's done. What is his legacy? Has he murdered? He doesn't know. We're going to be paying that off in episode 6. That's one of the things that I'm really looking forward to, is just what he does when he gets back to the TVA. I'm often on the fence about extended cuts and or director's cuts, but I honestly could have watched a whole 42-minute episode if you wanted to extend the length of the show to 7 episodes and just given me episode 6, Mobius and Classic Loki debate whether Alligator Loki is a variant or not. I know it's a very unwieldy title, but I think it would have worked. I would happily watch that, because this small little scene we get between Owen Wilson and Richard E. Grant, I would have loved to have seen more interaction between these two characters. It doesn't appear based on the events in this episode that we're going to get that, but I would love to see even the smallest little chunk. I mean, listen, they gave us like a 5-minute loop of Zemo dancing and pumping his fist in Captain America and the Winter Soldier, or Falcon and the Winter Soldier, whichever one you want to call it. I want to see the outtakes or the extended version of this conversation, because I just find it delightful. I just like both of these actors. Plus, is Alligator Loki a variant? Maybe I was right. Maybe he's not a variant. I want in on this debate too. While this debate is raging inside, or kind of just politely being mellowly discussed, Loki and Sylvie are doing some bonding outside. They share a magical blanket that Sylvie does not find very comfortable. I've got to admit, it looks not very comfortable either. Kind of thin. Come on, Loki, you can do better. And then they talk about this bond that they share. Loki says, hey, maybe when this is all over, we can figure out what the next step is together. And I know a lot of people have been weirded out by this concept of a romance between Loki and Sylvie. I'm not rooting for that, honestly. I don't really want these two to get together. I think it'd be kind of weird. It's kind of like when Lorraine McFly kisses Marty in Back to the Future and says, it's like kissing my brother. I think that you'd get that same kind of vibe if Sylvie and Loki got together. I do feel that kind of romantic thing coming from Loki. I don't really feel it so much coming from Sylvie. So I wonder if these two characters do get to stay together in any form at the end of next week's show. What is the form and function of that relationship going to be? You can put me in the non-ship category, though, if you're keeping track at home. Mobius uses a tempad to head back to the TVA, where he says he's going to burn it down and thanks Loki for the spark. And then Mobius and Loki have the moment that I've been waiting for, just a great bro hug. Just these two just finally just hugging it out. It's so great to see. I also love that Mobius whispers over Loki's shoulder to Sylvie, you're my favorite. I just, these are great Owen Wilson moments. He's so made for this character, or maybe the character was made for him. Either way, like I said, what Mobius is going to do next week is one of the things that I'm looking forward to. I think we're going to see a lot of big confrontations, him and Ravonna, where the TVA is going to be, lots of questions left to be answered. And then we get to the big action finale of this episode. And this was as impressive as anything else I've seen on any of the other Marvel Disney Plus shows. This was so well scored, so well choreographed, and it was just awesome. Just a really, really cool scene. We have Loki and Sylvie confronting Alioth. Sylvie needs a distraction in order to start her enchantment process, so Loki uses a sword that he was given by Kid Loki to kind of do the Jeff Goldblum with the flare, hey, 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 you know, but that's not a big enough distraction, and it looks like Sylvie might be done for. But then Richard E. Grant, the badass that he is, classic Loki, shows up and summons this entire, like, full-scale fake Asgard, just enchanting magic just coming up from the ground, and he's got the green light coming out of his hands. You can see that this is very difficult for him to do, but these Lokis are very powerful, and that's the distraction that we need. This was a real on your left moment, and like I said, it doesn't look like we're going to get a whole lot of Richard E. Grant. Maybe this is the only episode, unless Alioth doesn't kill these Lokis. It certainly looked like classic Loki was a goner, but if this is the only episode that we get, what a great tactical use of him, and for him to come in and have this hero moment at the end. I just love the way that this looked, and it had a functional purpose. It wasn't like classic Loki died in vain. With their powers combined, Loki and Sylvie did not make Captain Planet, but they did enchant Alioth, and that opened the way to this doorway, this portal to wherever they're headed next. Whatever this building is, wherever they're going, this is where the answers that they're looking for lie. And of course, that's also where we stopped this week's episode. There was no post-credits scene, so we don't even have a hint of what's coming up next week, but I am hyped. I am excited. I can't wait for this episode. Like I said, I have fallen in love with this show. The first two episodes I really liked. I liked episode 3. The last 2, 4, and 5 have built on the foundation that was laid in the first half of the show, and now we're really building up to some interesting things. Now, there's always the chance that, and this has happened before, that the answers to the questions aren't as fascinating as asking the questions themselves, but as of right now, if Loki can stick the landing, and I don't even mean like a perfect 10, if it can hit like an 8 or a 9 next week, this is going to be one of my favorite things that the MCU has ever produced. The real mark of just beginning to end what these shows can be alongside the best of WandaVision. And that's really where I'm putting Loki. I'm going to put the entirety of Loki right now, and hopefully this will be the case next week with episode 6, up against the best of WandaVision, which I thought was a lot of that show, but not all of that show. What do you think? Are you on the edge of your seat like I am for the 6th episode of Loki next week? Let me know down in the comments below. And as always, if you want to see even more of what I'm up to, you can check me out on Patreon at patreon.com/Dan Murrell. There's also plenty of stuff left coming up this week. We've got the release of an MCU movie coming up on Friday, Black Widow. I have a review that you can watch right now. It's a non-spoiler review. All kinds of great stuff coming up. Thank you so much for watching. I'll see you back here next week for the series, who knows, finale of Loki. Until then, stay safe, and thanks for watching.